Okay, so in this series we're going to basically be learning Blender, starting from the basic exercises and slowly expanding on those exercises, doing more and more complicated ones. My goal is to teach Blender in a way that's more structured. We're going to start with the fundamentals, and then slowly we're going to advance to new more complicated challenges. And basically our end goal is something we will have in mind from the start. So let's say right now this is going to be our first model, and this is going to be a low poly tier. This is so we can get comfortable with the Blender navigation and just the basic tools that we're going to be using on later on. Now I've done some custom settings to my layout, and this is something I've already covered in a previous video. I'll link it in the description below so you can watch it out if you want. But basically I've just made some navigation changes, and over here this color, it's basically due to my Metacap. I always like to work on Metacap. I just don't like the studio version. With Metacap I turn on shadow, cavity set to both, and I usually turn on random colors. It just makes it visually more appealing for me to work on these models. Now first thing is the basic layout of Blender. This is what you get when you open Blender. You get a cube, you get a camera, and you get a light. Now on your right side, this is where you can see your hierarchy, and this is where anytime you create any object in Blender, it's going to be listed here. So for example, if I go to add mesh UV sphere, you can see now we have a sphere over here, even though if I don't see it here, it's just inside of my cube, right? So any object that I create is automatically created and added over here on the right side in my hierarchy. Now on this left side, this is going to be our tools that we're going to be using. For now we're only going to cover 3 of these tools. First is move, second is rotate, and third is scale, but we'll get into this later on. And for navigation, these are the tools for our navigation that we're also going to cover. So first off, when we enter the scene, let's delete our camera. So over here I'm going to press X, delete this. Let me just turn on. Now that we have our camera deleted, I'm also going to delete this light over here, and I'm also going to delete this sphere over here. So we're only left with the cube. Now for navigation, first off we have rotation, which is this gizmo over here, or you can also do it with the middle mouse button on your keyboard. So for example, if I select a cube and I rotate, it's basically going to start rotating around it. Again, it's a navigation thing. Setting that I have changed. If you haven't done the same setting, your will always be rotated in the center of the world. This over here where X and Y axis meet, this is basically the center of the world. Okay, so first off we have rotation, and again you can either click over here to rotate around it, or just your middle mouse button to rotate around this. Then if I press on any of these buttons, it's going to take me to that particular view. Now on your left side you get the information about your scene. So right now this is front perspective. If I click on this button, it's going to be front orthographic. On x-axis, this is now right orthographic, and then if I click on this further, now this is back orthographic, right? Orthographic view and perspective view basically have one difference. It's in the name. Perspective view has a perspective, while orthographic view is more 2D in nature. Now if you want a clear example of this, so for example, I'm this zoomed in on my cube, and if I click on perspective view, right, I'm still looking at my cube from the front, but I can see the underneath side of this cube, right? If I go to the left side, I can see the left, and if I go to the right side, I can see the right. Basically right now I'm panning. The way that you pan is using this hand over here, or shift middle mouse button for panning, right? But you can see if I go to the left, I'm seeing the left side of this cube, and that's because of perspective. Now if I were to do the same action but in orthographic view, no matter how close I get or how much left or right I go, I'll never be able to see the left or right side or the top or bottom side of the cube. That's because in orthographic view, you're looking at something without any perspective, without any camera angle, or without any, like, you're looking at it head on, right? So that's why you don't see any of the other sides. So this basically is more good when you're trying to do something more measured, right? When you're modeling something and you want to see if, like, how the proportions are and things like that, this will give you a good idea because of the grids behind and because there's no perspective. In perspective mode, it gets very deceptive because you don't know what it actually looks like because of the perspective. This is something you'll understand more once, like, we actually start creating stuff. But usually when you're modeling, it's better to model in orthographic view, and then if you want to view your model in perspective view, you can. I usually just prefer orthographic, and then I render in perspective view, but that's just a personal preference. Okay, so first off, we have our rotation, which we have discussed. Now second off, we have panning, which is this hand tool over here. This is shift middle mouse button to pan up, left, right, whatever direction you want. And this is basically like if you're drawing on a paper, you're moving the paper left, right, top, bottom, whichever direction you want. So this is basically you're moving it in a 2D way, right? So you can see I'm not moving closer or further away from the cube. I'm just moving it up and down my screen. Now this over here, this is your zoom in, zoom out, right? I can do this with my middle mouse button, just like scroll with it, and that's zooming in, or I can zoom out. And this is this is just something you should already be familiar with. It's like something you do in almost every software. Okay, now with these tools out of the way, we can discuss these tools on the left side. So if you look at this first tool, this is basically our move tool. Now Blender is a very heavy shortcut heavy tool, so I would recommend getting into the habit of shortcuts. But if you prefer this gizmo, that's completely up to you. Usually I don't recommend them and I don't prefer them. I'm just not used to them. Again, it's a personal choice. It's up to you. Okay, so if I want to move this, I can move this on the x-axis, which is the red line. I can move it on the y-axis, which is the green line, or I can move it on the z-axis, which is the blue line. Now I can move this on x and y, but not on z-axis, or I can move this on x and z, but not on the y-axis, right? And same thing over here. I can just exclude one of the x's over here. Now we can also do this with the keyboard shortcut. If I press G on my keyboard and I press Z, it's basically going to move it on the Z axis. Now if I press X, it's only going to move it on the X axis, and then Y means it's moving it on the Y. Now you can see when I'm moving it on the Y, I don't actually see it moved, and that's because we're looking at it from like a head-on view. So this view, you can see we can only see the blue and the red line. I don't see the green line. If I rotate, now I see the green line. So now I can see how much it's going forward or backward. So this is just something for you to keep in mind when you're moving. You're moving in 3 dimensions. So usually if you're not sure you're moving in one direction or not, just make sure you lock your axis whenever you're moving. So if you're using the shortcut, make sure you press X and Y axis until or unless you're at a very comfortable stage and you know what you're doing. Then you don't really have to like press those axes. Okay, now second thing, this move thing that we have learned, you can do this with rotation. You can do this with scale. So if I go to rotation over here, I can rotate on the x-axis. I can rotate on the x-axis, right? I can rotate on the z, and I can rotate on the y. Now let me just undo. And the shortcut for this is R and then X to basically rotate on the X, Y to rotate on the Y, and Z to rotate on the Z. Now while I'm doing this, you can see that there's certain value on the top right of my screen, right? Now let me undo this. And this is something you'll see in a lot of videos. Somebody says rotate this on the z-axis by 45 degrees. You just go RZ45, right? I just typed it in on my keyboard and it entered over here on my top right. Now if I backspace, it's going to erase 5 and then I can add something else over there, right? This is something you get very used to. So rotate on the X by 90, rotate on the Y 30, whatever like value you want. And this lets you work very fast when you're working in Blender. Okay. I'm not that familiar with the shortcut, this tool over here. Okay. Next thing is scaling. Again, you can scale on the Y, you can scale on the X, and you can scale on X and Y, but not scale on the Z, right? And same thing applies with the shortcut. S is for scale. So S, Y, S, X, S, Z. And if you want to like exclude one of the X's, you can press S, Shift Z, and that just excludes it. Again, if this doesn't make sense, it will make sense once we actually start using these tools. You'll get more and more accustomed to these. Now, let's just delete all of this and whatever we have learned so far, navigation wise and everything, we're going to put that into practice. So let's just delete this cube over here and I'm going to switch back to my default select box tool. Then over here, I'm going to go to add, mesh, and cube. Now, before we start making anything, it's always a good practice to have some sort of reference either open in a separate screen or inside of Blender. I usually prefer having it open inside of Blender so I can like easily look at it. So over here in this line, you can see the separation between the two windows. If I right click on it, I can basically horizontal split this window, and you can see now this window has two divisions. This one I'll change to image editor, and in this one I'm going to open my reference image, which is an image of this simple low poly chair that we're going to make. Now we need to start at some point. So usually you start with whatever point you think is the most like clear or the most centered thing of that mesh, right? For this, we're going to start with the base of the chair, right? Okay, so let's just assume this is my cube and this is the base of the chair. I'm going to first scale it down. So S and Z to scale it down on the Z axis. It's up to me how much width I want. And then G and Z to move it up. Usually in Blender, you just treat the X and Y as an imaginary ground, and you always want your model to be above the ground. So if this is the base of the chair, this is going to be the leg of the chair, right? And I'm basically using the grid as a guide for me. Again, if I was doing it in perspective view, I wouldn't see the grid. So this is why I would prefer doing this with the grid. Now I have the base of the chair over here. Now I need another cube. I can go in and add a cube again, but usually it's much more convenient. If you already have a shape, you just duplicate this. So if I select this cube and I press Shift D, it's going to duplicate this cube. Then I press escape, so it snaps back to that original position. Then I'm going to just move it down over here. And then I want to scale it down on the x-axis, right, to make it thinner. Now, again, because we are working in 3D space, we need to keep in mind that it's a 3D space, right? So if I scale it down on the x-axis, I also want to scale it down on the y-axis. But it's not just that I want to scale them in both of those axes. I want it to be scaled the same on the x and the y. So it's basically a square and it retains that proportion. To do this, we can just press S, Shift Z. So it's going to scale on x and y together, but just not the z axis, right? So now you can see it's a perfect cube, but it just like kept the proportion but just didn't scale on the z axis, and that's what we wanted. Now once I have this done, I can move it on the x axis over here, and then I can scale it on the z-axis, something like this, then press G and Z, move it down, sure, something like this. And now once I'm happy with this, I'm gonna go to my right view, which is this one over here, and then move this in place, which is around here. Now if I want to make this slightly more thinner, I can. And once we're happy with this, we're just going to keep it as it is. Now I have added this over here. I need to repeat this step 3 more times to get the rest of the legs. We can do this by hand, but it's not going to be perfect. Like, we can make it perfect by copying the values and everything and just doing a bunch of maths, but we don't really have to. We can just go over here. This is basically different properties panel for our objects. For now, we're just gonna go to this modifier panel, which is the most common thing you would be using here. And then I'm going to add a mirror modifier to this. For this mirror modifier, if I press X, Y, or Z, I don't see anything happening. And that's because whenever you mirror something, it's mirrored from your pivot point, which is this yellow dot on your model. You can see if I select this, it also has a pivot, which is at the center, right? Now, how can we move these pivots to where we want? That's a separate question, and that's something we'll get more into when we do more complex exercises. But for now, we don't want to use this as a pivot for the mirror. We want to use the chair as a pivot. And as soon as I did this, you can see we got a bunch of these copies. Now let me turn off the z-axis because we don't really need it. And now you can see we are getting this leg duplicated on the X and Y. You can see we can turn these on and off and you'll see them. And this is exactly what we wanted, right? Now, let me just duplicate this once more so I can make the upper leg. So I'm just going to press Shift D to duplicate it. G and Z, move it up, and then go back. This time, I don't want these on the x-axis, so I'm going to turn it off. And then now I can just maybe slightly rotate this back, maybe because I want the back to be slightly tilted. Something like this. And I want this to be slightly thicker than the bottom legs. Okay, something like this. I'm going to duplicate this again, right? But instead of doing duplicating this, I'm going to duplicate this leg because this is straight. Move it up. Again, remove the mirror modifier because we don't really need this anymore. Now I need to rotate this flat in this direction, so it's easier for me to like mess around with this. To do this, I'm going to rotate this on the x-axis, right, by 90 degrees. Again, you can't see the x-axis when you're looking at it in front view, but if you rotate your view, you can see the red line. Now, if I press R, X, and then type in 90, you can see this is something we already practiced when doing the tutorial. Now I can move this in place. So something like this. Scale it down. Okay, so this is something wrong that I did is I'm right now in my right orthographic view. I should have been working in my front orthographic view, and that's like a common mistake that you can make, but make sure if you do see it, you fix it. So I'm gonna go to my front orthographic view over here, which is this one. Okay, this one over here, and let me just, instead of the y-axis, let me just do the x-axis, and let me delete this and let me rotate it correctly. Okay, something like this. And then this we need to rotate on the z-axis by 90, so it's basically facing us. Now this is how my chair should look, and it looks fine. So I'm going to move it back over here, place it, rotate it, and maybe scale it down, something like this. Okay, right now this looks slightly tilted to me, so I'm gonna make sure the rotation is okay. If I open this panel over here and I go to item, you can see my rotations over here. For now, let me just make all of these 0, 0, 0. So basically my model is completely flat. Then I can slightly rotate it just like I did before. And then I can go back and make sure everything looks fine. So that weird rotation that I was feeling, it's now gone. And I think this is just slightly too much. So let me just, okay, something like this. Then I can duplicate this and I can press G and Z to move it down. Now, if I press G and Z, you can see it's moving it down, but it's also moving it back. And that's because our model is slightly rotated. If I want Blender to respect the rotation that I've given it, I need to press G and then Z twice. And this, sorry, G and Y twice, not Z. And this basically takes you to your local axis. Again, you can see it over here written along local Y. Now, if I press G and Y, you can see it right now it's moving on the global Y, which basically means it's taking the Y axis of the entire world. But when I say, when I press Y twice and now it says local Y, it's looking at the Y axis of this object, which basically means if you are like rotated in physical world, right, your front, right and left should be different than someone else who's rotated in a different direction, right? So this is basically what it's doing when it's looking at local axis. It's respecting your rotation that you have given your object. Now I can move it down and it's gonna move straight down where it's supposed to go. Then I'm going to duplicate this again and then do the same thing again. Move it down somewhere like this and it should be fine. Okay, now that we have this done, we need to add this base underneath this. So I'm going to duplicate this, move it down and then scale this, S, Shift Z, and scale it back just a bit, right? Something like this. And then we can also add these over here. So I'm going to Shift D to duplicate this, remove the mirror, rotate it on the rotate it on the Y by 90. Move it over here, scale it down, maybe scale it like this, and then position it over here. I don't really have to do it by like hand. I can just use the mirror modifier. So let me just use that instead. Okay. Now you can see we have modeled the chair like in the reference, and you can mess around with this as much as you want, like mess with the proportions. So let's say I'm not happy with these. I can move these around. As much as I want, right? Okay, I hope so far you've been able to follow along. If not, if you have any questions, just let me know. Okay, so this looks good, this looks fine, but for all of our projects, we're also going to make a render for it, and that's not something much that you have to do, but it's a good like practice to have a showcase for all of your projects, right? So over here, let me just create a new collection and we'll just name it camera or something. And then I'm gonna go over here to add in this camera option and then just move this camera back. I'm pressing G to move it back, and let's just place it here. Then if I press this camera button, it takes me to my camera view, and right now this is what my camera sees. Now if I go to my view and if I go to this camera to view option, I can basically move this around and orient my camera to however I want my camera to look at the chair. So let's say this is the view I want to capture. Okay, sure, something like this is fine. And then you turn this off. You never have it on all the time, only when you need this. Okay, now that this is done, we're going to render this out. Now if I go over here and if I go to render image, Basically, we're gonna get a gray image, and the reason we're getting this is because we don't have any light source, and we need a light source in our scene to get the image properly captured. To get the light source, we're gonna go over here into our world properties, and over here we're gonna change this to environment texture. In 3D world, so basically think about it, if you are in your room and you capture a photo of something in your room, it's going to have the reflections of like your surroundings of your room, right? And if you were to take a picture of that same thing but in a different environment, it might look different, it might reflect different lights from different angles or whatever, right? Depending on where you took the picture. Same thing happens in 3D. So if I go over here, this is a normal website that you would use. This is called HDRI Haven. And if we go over here, we go to the HDRI, you can download any of these HDRIs and you can see how basically they would like they show you a preview of how a glass would look with this light, how a plastic would look, how a metal would look. Sorry, that wasn't plastic, this is, right? So it just shows you an example of these different materials and you can choose whichever one you want. For now, I already have some downloaded, so I'm going to use those, but you can download one and use that. I'm gonna go over here, go to my downloads folder, and for now, let me just pick this one. I think this one should be fine. Okay, now let's go to our render image. And now you can see our chair is nicely lit and we get the render nicely done. But we can see the background. We don't really want to see the background. So I'm going to go over here into my renders tab and I'm just going to make my film transparent. And now if I render this again, I'm getting a much better, like there's no background, which is what I wanted. Now, some few settings we can also do is, first off, I'm going to change this to cycles because cycles has a much better light bounce on it than Eevee does. Eevee is like a game rendering and cycle is more realistic. For samples, you don't really need these high, so I'm just going to keep it 100. And then render image. It usually takes a bit longer for cycles to render, but things usually end up looking nicer. Right. Okay. Now, once I have this image, you can see it looks nice, right? But we have these very, very sharp angles, right? And in real life, nothing is supposed to be this sharp. And if you want like a realistic light bounce, it's better to not have things that are this flat in your model. It's not a good practice. To fix this, what we can do is go into the modifiers tab and add a bevel modifier. This is again all aesthetics, so if you don't want to do this, it's fine. Now this bevel modifier, when I add this, it's just going to smooth your corners. So let me just smooth this out, right? But it's smoothing over here a lot less than what it's doing over here. And that's because a lot of modifiers in Blender, they basically depend on the scale of your object, right? So if Blender sees the scale is something like this, it's going to apply bevel based off this scale. So to make this one-to-one accurate, we go to Object, Apply, and Apply Scale. And now you can see our legs are equally rounded. Now let me just bring this back over here to something like this. Right? And now it looks a lot nicer. You can see how it reflects. To get rid of this, I can just shade it smooth, and now you can see it looks even nicer. If I want, I can just increase the subdivision a bit more to get more segments. And now you can see our cube, it's being rounded off at the corners. And it's up to you how much rounded off you want this to be. And with like depending on how much you give it roundedness, it would have a different look. So if it's more rounded, it would look more softer, and this would look more like sturdy or something, right? So again, play around with this until you're happy with this, and then just go with the value. Then over here, I'm gonna go and apply scale for this. I'm going to just select all of these and go to object, apply scale, and then let me just add the bevel modifier to all of these. Now, if I want to copy the bevel modifier from this object onto other objects, I can. So I select this, shift click on this, shift click on this, shift click on all of these. Then I'm going to shift click on this at the very end. Then over here, go copy to selected, and it's going to basically copy the modifier with all of its settings onto all of these objects, right? And then I don't have to repeat this step for all of these. Now I can just right click, shade smooth, so it looks nicer. And now if I go over here, so let me just change this so I can show the difference. I'm going to change this to slot 2 and then render it again. Now you can see if I press J, this was our before, and now this is much nicer, lighter bounce that's happening over here. Right? You can notice it on all of these corners. It's just much nicer to look at. Okay. Now that with this done, we can just go to the final step and give this color. So I'm gonna go to this material tab over here, create new, give this some name, chair for now, and then give it some color. For now, I'll just use some sort of pink. And then I'm going to press A to select everything else, and then to transfer this material onto every object, I just press Ctrl L, link materials. So now all of these objects have the same material. Now if I go to render, and again, you don't have to like render each time. You can go into material preview and look at the color of this and mess around with this. So let's say this is too pink. I can mess around with this until I'm happy with this. So let's say I want to tone down the saturation, maybe change the hue a bit, maybe something like this. And then if I want to make it brighter, less brighter, whatever I want, I can like choose whatever color I want. And then I can make this metallic if I want, or just a normal chair with some more reflections or maybe less reflections. Right, for now we're not gonna mess too much with the material properties. We're just going to keep it like a simple material. That's again something we'll cover more in depth later on. Now render image. Okay, awesome. Now I'm going to do this one more time, but this time I'm just going to change my HDRI to something else. Right, before we were using this image. Now let's say I want to use this image, and let's just see what difference it makes. Okay, now basically the only reason I did this is just to show you how something will look different depending on the HDRI that you're using, right? So this is the same color, same chair, but just with different lighting, except for the first one that didn't have any material on it. But this should give you an idea. Okay, so this was the first exercise. I hope you were able to follow along. If you didn't, if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm gonna continue with adding more and more complex exercises, and we're going to basically build our Blender skills by following along these examples.